Inside a gleaming private hangar, Mason Carter wanted only one thing: his final paycheck after months repairing a neglected fleet of jets. Instead, Amelia Grace, the arrogant chief executive of Aeronova, hurled his contract onto the concrete and laughed coldly. "Sue me." She had no idea the quiet single father standing before her had already logged every unauthorized flight order, every forged signature hidden inside her company's records. When night fell, Mason walked into the rain carrying a folder addressed directly to federal aviation investigators. Before sunrise broke over the runway, her entire empire had been sealed shut. If you want to see how Mason brought a proud executive before federal law, stay with this until the end. The private hangar belonging to Aeronova gleamed under rows of white industrial lights, its polished floor reflecting the sleek bodies of jets built for billionaires and celebrities who never asked what it cost to keep them safe. Mason Carter moved through that brightness like a shadow that did not belong there, wearing a faded maintenance jacket streaked with grease, carrying a battered toolbox that had outlived 2 decades of contract work. He was not the kind of man anyone noticed first. He did not raise his voice, did not posture, did not explain himself unless asked. Around him, junior technicians hurried past with clipboards, eager to look busy in front of supervisors, while Mason simply worked, running his fingers along seams and rivets with the patience of someone who understood that machines told the truth even when people did not. The company had built its name on exclusivity. Aeronova promised private travel with no delays, no questions, and no compromises, a fleet curated for clients who valued discretion above almost everything else. Mason had been brought in as outside contract labor, called only when the regular maintenance crew hit problems they could not solve on their own. Most of the staff treated him the way people treat a repairman they assume is replaceable, someone hired to fix what others had broken and then quietly disappear. Mason had grown used to that treatment. He did not need admiration. He needed the aircraft leaving that hangar to be safe enough to land again. Amelia Grace was introduced to the story the way the industry press had always introduced her, as the sharp young executive who had transformed a modest charter service into a status symbol for the ultra-wealthy. She walked through her own hangar with the confidence of someone who had never been told no twice. On this particular week, she was consumed by a single deal that could multiply the company's value many times over, a contract with a group of high-profile investors who wanted exclusive access to her fleet during the coming travel season. If the agreement closed, Aeronova would leap into an entirely new financial category. If it fell apart, the investors would walk, and so would the confidence of everyone watching. Lucas Owen, the operations director, felt that pressure most directly, and he passed it downward without hesitation. He pushed the technical staff to move faster, to close out inspection checklists before shifts ended, to sign off on aircraft that were scheduled to fly again within hours. Speed had become the only currency that mattered inside those walls. Mason noticed something the newer staff missed entirely. The maintenance records looked too clean, too uniform, as if someone had been smoothing over details rather than documenting them, while several of the actual airframes showed wear that did not match anything written down. He did not raise an alarm immediately. Instead, he began doing what he had always done during his years working near serious safety investigations, quietly gathering proof. He photographed panel seams, noted part numbers, compared dates on paperwork against the physical condition of the aircraft in front of him. A brief phone call interrupted his focus that afternoon, a short conversation about an overdue bill waiting at home, the kind of quiet responsibility that shaped every decision he made but that he never spoke about at work. He ended the call quickly and returned to the jet in front of him, running his palm along a section of the fuselage near the forward cabin door. That was where he found it. A hairline fracture, nearly invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look, sitting precisely where pressure would concentrate once the aircraft climbed to altitude. It was not damage that belonged on a jet cleared for passenger flight. It was the kind of flaw that lived quietly until the moment it did not. Mason knelt lower and examined the fracture more closely, and it became obvious this was no minor cosmetic flaw. A temporary patch had been applied using material that did not meet the standard required for structural repair, a shortcut meant to hide the problem rather than fix it. Beneath the patch, faint marks suggested the aircraft had absorbed some kind of impact, something that should have triggered a formal inspection and a detailed report. Instead, the paperwork told a different story entirely. One where the airframe had passed every check, cleared every requirement, and been approved for continued service without incident. He turned to Connor Isaac, a young mechanic who had been with the company barely a year, and asked him plainly what he knew about the aircraft's recent history. Connor's eyes shifted toward the office windows before he answered, the posture of someone who understood exactly what silence protected him from. Mason did not pressure him. He simply reminded Connor, in a calm and steady voice, that an airplane was not like a car in a garage, that a single false signature could one day be measured in lives rather than dollars. Something in that statement broke through Connor's hesitation. He admitted in a low voice that Lucas Owen had told the maintenance team to make the records look presentable because the executive office did not want delays affecting the flight schedule. Mason asked to see the original maintenance log rather than the summary version that had been circulated. What he found troubled him even more. Several signatures appeared nearly identical despite supposedly belonging to different inspectors. Recorded inspection times did not align with actual shift schedules. Parts listed as newly replaced were, upon closer inspection, clearly the same aging components that had been there for years. Lucas appeared before Mason could dig any further, his tone friendly in the practiced way of someone accustomed to smoothing over tension with charm rather than honesty. He told Mason to simply finish the job he had been hired for and leave the heroics to people who understood how the business actually worked. Mason answered without raising his voice, saying he would not sign off on safety certification for an aircraft carrying a pressure-related structural crack. Lucas's expression shifted, and he reminded Mason that his final payment was still pending, that the contract carried unfavorable clauses for contractors who caused disruptions, and that Aeronova retained lawyers far more powerful than any technician on payroll. Mason remained unmoved. He requested that the flight schedule be paused until the aircraft received a proper structural inspection, one performed to standard rather than one designed to satisfy a deadline. Lucas walked away and reported the exchange to Amelia, but he reshaped the story as he told it, describing Mason as a disgruntled contractor trying to inflate a minor technical note into leverage for a bigger payout. Amelia was already under considerable strain because of the looming investor deal, and the mention of a delay, combined with a name she barely recognized, was enough to sour her mood before she had even seen the actual evidence herself. By the following morning, despite Mason's written warning sitting untouched in an inbox somewhere inside the company's systems, the scheduled VIP flight remained exactly where it had been, unchanged and unquestioned, as if the crack beneath the cabin door did not exist at all. Amelia arrived at the hangar the next day, dressed for the investors touring the facility, her heels clicking against the polished floor as assistants and department heads trailed behind her. She wanted the entire operation to look flawless. Gleaming aircraft, quiet, compliant staff, a schedule that ran without interruption. Mason stood near the jet with the fractured fuselage, holding a folder of technical documentation he had assembled overnight. Amelia glanced at her watch before addressing him, making it clear she had little patience to spare for a contractor's concerns during such a sensitive morning. Mason spoke plainly and without exaggeration. He described the crack in the airframe, the inconsistencies in the maintenance log, the mismatched part numbers, and the signatures that raised serious doubts about who had actually performed the inspections being claimed. For a brief moment, something in Amelia's expression flickered, as though she were genuinely weighing what he said. But Lucas interrupted almost immediately, insisting that Mason misunderstood standard procedure and was simply trying to stretch out his contract to extract additional payment before his departure. In front of the gathered investors and staff, Amelia asked Mason whether he had anything substantial enough to justify jeopardizing a deal worth an enormous amount of money. Mason handed over photographs, measurement readouts, and copies of the internal warnings he had already submitted through the proper reporting line. Amelia barely skimmed them. Her attention stayed fixed on the financial risk of grounding a flight rather than on the details laid out clearly in front of her. One of the investors asked casually whether the fleet had any issues worth discussing, and Amelia answered with a practiced smile, assuring him everything remained fully under control. Mason spoke directly then, without softening the message for the sake of appearances. He told her that if the aircraft took off as scheduled, she would be knowingly placing passengers in danger. The room grew tense almost instantly. Amelia felt the weight of every eye turning toward her, employees and investors alike waiting to see how she would respond to being challenged so openly. Pride took hold where reason should have. She demanded that Mason sign a document certifying the aircraft was fit to operate, insisting that doing so would put an end to the entire disagreement immediately. Mason refused. Amelia lowered her voice, telling him a contract technician held no authority to bring her company to a standstill over what she considered an exaggerated concern. Mason answered that aviation safety regulations existed above any title, including hers. The words landed harder than she expected, and in front of investors she was trying to impress, the humiliation cut deep. She glanced around the hangar, aware that every technician within earshot had gone quiet, watching to see whether the woman who ran their careers would back down or dig in further. Lucas stood at her side, whispering that conceding anything in front of investors would be read as weakness, that a single grounded flight could unravel months of careful positioning with people who did not tolerate uncertainty. Amelia absorbed that advice the way she absorbed most advice that confirmed what she already wanted to believe, nodding once and letting her jaw set harder. She reminded herself more than anyone else that she had built Aeronova from almost nothing, that every contract, every client relationship, every polished aircraft in that hangar existed because she had refused to let obstacles slow her down. A cracked panel reported by a technician she barely knew felt, in that moment, like exactly the kind of obstacle she had trained herself to push past. Rather than reconsidering, Amelia turned to Lucas and instructed him to prepare termination paperwork for Mason immediately, right there inside the hangar where the confrontation had unfolded in front of everyone watching. Lucas returned within minutes, carrying a termination notice along with a payment stub that had been reduced almost to nothing, justified by a note claiming Mason had failed to complete his assigned work. Mason looked at the figure and understood immediately what they were attempting, using money as a way to silence him rather than address the danger sitting inside their own hangar. He did not raise his voice. He simply asked that the company cover the outstanding repair costs, the inspection fees already owed to him, and that the flagged aircraft be grounded until it received a proper safety review. Amelia laughed in front of the assembled staff, the sound sharp and dismissive. She suggested that Mason was playing the role of a wronged hero, a poor contractor standing up to a powerful corporation for sympathy rather than substance. Mason reminded her calmly that he had submitted internal warnings on 3 separate occasions and had received no formal response from anyone in leadership. Amelia snatched the termination papers from Lucas' hands and threw them onto the floor, letting them land near Mason's boots as if discarding something beneath her notice. She looked at him with open contempt and said 2 words that would follow her for the rest of her career: "Sue me." The hangar fell completely silent. A few employees lowered their eyes, unwilling to witness what was happening to a man who had done nothing but tell the truth. Mason bent down, picked up the papers, brushed the dust from them, and asked Amelia whether she was certain she wanted that particular statement attached to the official record of this incident. She answered with a thin, humorless smile, telling him he was welcome to try litigation if he could somehow afford it. Lucas added his own remarks, telling Mason he needed to remember his place among people far more important than himself. Mason said nothing in response. He looked past both of them toward the aircraft still sitting exactly where it had been scheduled to depart the next morning, and his mind stayed fixed on that flight rather than on his own wounded pride. He turned and walked out of the hangar into a light, steady rain, offering no parting insult, no dramatic final word, nothing that would give either of them the satisfaction of a scene. Connor watched him leave from a distance, guilt written plainly across his face for having stayed silent earlier that day. Amelia assumed she had won simply because Mason walked away without a fight, mistaking his composure for defeat. The moment he reached the parking area, he opened the trunk of his car and retrieved a waterproof case he had prepared in advance. One contained copies of the maintenance logs, photographs of the fracture, part numbers, internal emails, flight schedules, pressure readings, and clear evidence of signatures that did not match the technicians they were supposedly attributed to. He called Hannah Madison, an aviation attorney who had worked with him years earlier during a separate safety investigation. She asked whether every piece of documentation had a clear, legitimate source. Mason explained that everything came directly from work he had been assigned, company emails sent to his own account, and physical inspections he had personally conducted. Hannah's response was brief and pointed. If that aircraft still had a flight scheduled for the following morning, there was no time left to pursue a lawsuit first. Mason looked back at the hangar glowing behind sheets of rain and made his decision. He would not take Amelia to court before making sure the people responsible for keeping aircraft safe had every piece of evidence first. Mason drove to a small diner near the airport, a place with reliable internet and few enough customers that no one paid attention to a tired man working alone at a corner table. He did not go home first, even though exhaustion pulled at every part of him. A brief glance at a photo on his locked phone screen reminded him why he kept moving, before he turned the device face down and returned his attention to the folder in front of him, the quiet weight of fatherhood present only as a private steadying force rather than something spoken aloud. He organized the documents with methodical care, arranging them by aircraft, by specific defect, by the name attached to each falsified signature, by date, and by which scheduled flights carried the greatest risk. Hannah Madison joined him through a video call, guiding him toward language that stayed factual and precise rather than emotional or accusatory, reminding him repeatedly that the report needed to read as a record of events and evidence, not as a personal grievance against people who had wronged him. Mason submitted an urgent safety report through the proper federal reporting pathway, attaching a formal request for inspection before the scheduled morning departure. He also sent a duplicate copy directly to Jackson Wyatt, an inspector he remembered from an earlier case involving counterfeit aircraft components. At first, only an automated confirmation appeared on his screen, and Mason had no way of knowing whether anyone would actually review the material before the sun came up over the runway. Within minutes, his phone rang. Jackson asked precise, methodical questions. The aircraft's identification number, the exact location of the structural fracture, the part numbers involved, the name attached to the falsifiable lineup of the next scheduled flight. Mason answered every question without hesitation, his voice steady despite the hour. Jackson paused briefly after the final answer, then said that if the documentation held up, this was no longer a simple dispute but a serious operational safety concern requiring immediate attention. Meanwhile, inside Aeronova's glass-walled office overlooking the hangar, Amelia continued celebrating with the investors who remained on site, unaware that anything had shifted. Lucas assured her the matter had been handled, insisting that Mason lacked the resources or the standing to cause any real disruption. Amelia checked the flight schedule for the following morning and allowed herself a small measure of relief, believing the worst of the evening had already passed. An assistant asked cautiously whether the flight should be delayed as a precaution, given the earlier disagreement. Amelia dismissed the suggestion outright, stating firmly that she would not let a dismissed technician derail a deal this significant. Her confidence remained unshaken as the night wore on, even as, miles away, Jackson Wyatt began assembling an emergency inspection team, instructing them to be ready and in position at the airport well before dawn broke over the horizon. Jackson worked through the material Mason had provided with the discipline of someone who had seen careless paperwork ruin careers and, occasionally, cost lives. He cross-referenced tail numbers against public maintenance filings, noted the pattern of identical inspection times appearing across supposedly separate technicians, and flagged the fracture location as consistent with known stress points on that aircraft model. Nothing about the documentation suggested improvisation or exaggeration. It read like the work of someone who understood exactly what regulators needed to see and had taken care to preserve it properly. He contacted two colleagues directly, bypassing the usual morning queue of routine reports, and told them plainly that this case could not wait for standard business hours. One of them asked whether they had legal grounds to act before daylight. Jackson answered that a credible, well-documented safety threat involving an aircraft scheduled to carry passengers within hours gave them exactly the grounds they needed, and that waiting any longer would mean explaining afterward why they had not moved sooner. By 3 in the morning, Mason sat in his car outside the airport perimeter, waiting for a response he could not fully predict, uncertain whether federal action could realistically happen before the scheduled departure. Connor Isaac sent him a message during that stretch of silence, warning that Lucas had ordered several boxes of records quietly removed from the maintenance office. Mason told him not to take any unnecessary risks, only asking him to document the location of those boxes if it was safe to do so. Connor sent a photograph showing the boxes being loaded into a service vehicle near a side entrance rarely used at that hour. Mason forwarded the image directly to Jackson without hesitation. Jackson understood immediately that any further delay risked losing physical evidence that could not easily be recovered once it left the premises. Working alongside airport security, his team moved toward the Aeronova facility with quiet efficiency, avoiding anything that resembled a dramatic confrontation and focusing instead on securing what needed to be preserved. Jackson presented an emergency inspection order upon arrival, requiring that the flagged aircraft, its complete maintenance history, related component records, and current flight schedule all remain untouched pending review. The overnight staff on duty reacted with visible alarm and immediately called Lucas, who arrived within minutes still adjusting his jacket, insisting loudly that this entire situation stemmed from an internal misunderstanding that did not warrant federal involvement. Jackson asked directly who had authorized the morning flight despite a documented structural warning. Lucas hesitated, then said that decision required input from executive leadership before he could answer further. Amelia received the call at her apartment near the airport, irritated at first by being woken so early, briefly assuming this was some form of retaliation orchestrated by Mason out of spite. The moment she heard the words federal inspection, her irritation gave way instantly to genuine alarm, and she called her legal team without delay, but their response offered little comfort. They warned her that once inspectors arrived with specific documented evidence in hand, obstructing their work would only compound whatever legal exposure already existed. Mason remained a short distance away, watching quietly as the flagged aircraft was blocked from moving anywhere near the runway. He did not step forward as though claiming victory. He simply observed, aware that what mattered now belonged to a process far larger than his own grievance. Jackson gave the order to hold the entire affected fleet segment on the ground until every relevant inspection had been completed in full, a directive that would, within hours, bring the company's most profitable operations to a complete standstill. Inside the hangar, technicians who had spent the night rushing to meet an impossible schedule now stood along the walls watching strangers in federal jackets photograph the same panels Mason had photographed alone days earlier, with no one paying him any attention. A few of them exchanged uneasy glances, recognizing pieces of the fracture and the mismatched paperwork Mason had tried to raise weeks before anyone in leadership cared to listen. Lucas paced near the office entrance, phone pressed to his ear, trying to reach anyone in the legal department who might tell him this could still be contained quietly. Jackson's team worked methodically, tagging each affected component, photographing serial numbers, and cross-checking them against the digital maintenance database that Mason's documentation had already flagged as inconsistent. Nothing about their approach was rushed or theatrical. It was the deliberate, unhurried process of people who understood that a mistake made in haste during an investigation could undo months of careful evidentiary work, and who intended to make certain nothing about this case could later be dismissed as procedural error. By the time the sun rose fully over the runway, employees arriving for their regular shifts found the hangar entrance controlled by federal personnel and airport security rather than the usual morning crew. Vehicles belonging to the Aviation Authority lined the access road, and inspectors moved steadily between the office and the grounded aircraft. Word spread quickly among the staff. The primary fleet had been suspended from operation, maintenance records had been seized, and every VIP flight scheduled for that day had been canceled without explanation offered to waiting clients. This was the moment the story would later be remembered by, though the truth was more precise than the dramatic phrase that spread afterward. Federal investigators had not seized a building in any literal sense. They had sealed maintenance records, grounded the aircraft under review, and suspended the operating certifications tied directly to the falsified documentation, actions that left the company functionally paralyzed, even though the physical property remained standing exactly where it always had. Frustrated clients called repeatedly, demanding answers about canceled travel plans. Investors requested an emergency meeting before the morning had even properly begun. Aviation journalists gathered outside the gate once word leaked that a prominent luxury charter service had been abruptly grounded. Amelia arrived, still adjusting her appearance from a hurried morning, her expression composed but her eyes betraying the alarm she could not fully hide. The moment she spotted Mason standing beside Jackson near the hangar entrance, she understood immediately who had set this entire sequence of events into motion. She approached him directly, accusing him of sabotaging the company purely out of resentment over losing his position. Mason did not raise his voice or defend himself with anger. He simply reminded her that she had told him to pursue legal action if he wanted to, but that what unfolded here reached far beyond any personal dispute between the two of them. Jackson asked Amelia to accompany his team into a conference room for formal questioning regarding the events of the previous day. Lucas attempted to block Mason from entering as well, arguing that a former contractor had no standing to be present during an official inquiry. Jackson corrected him, explaining that Mason had provided the original technical documentation and retained the right to participate as requested by investigators conducting the review. Amelia found herself seated across from Mason inside the same glass-walled conference room where she had celebrated with investors only hours earlier, the space now stripped of celebration and filled instead with quiet tension. Jackson displayed the evidence methodically on a screen for the room to see. Photographs of the fracture, the internal warning emails Mason had sent, the flight schedule, the altered maintenance log, and the signatures that did not match the technicians credited with the work. Amelia began to understand, watching each piece appear in sequence, that Mason had fabricated nothing. Still clinging to some measure of authority, she asked whether a paperwork discrepancy truly justified endangering hundreds of jobs across the company. Mason answered that a single paperwork discrepancy was often the visible edge of dozens of deeper failures hiding beneath it. Jackson closed the session by announcing that sufficient grounds existed to open a full investigation into Aeronova's maintenance practices, its record-keeping, and the decisions made by its leadership in the days leading up to that morning. Amelia sat frozen for a long moment after Jackson finished speaking, watching the screen still displaying the photograph of the fracture beneath the cabin door, the same crack she had dismissed as an exaggeration less than a day earlier. She realized, with a discomfort she had rarely allowed herself to feel, that every assurance she had accepted from Lucas over recent weeks now looked less like confidence and more like convenient avoidance. The investors who had toured her hangar with such enthusiasm were, at that very moment, drafting messages asking whether their agreement could still proceed at all. Outside the conference room, staff members whispered among themselves, comparing notes on warnings they had personally seen ignored, small remarks about worn components, or rushed inspections that no one had thought worth escalating on their own. None of them had come forward the way Mason had, and standing now in the aftermath, several of them understood exactly why silence had felt safer, and exactly what that silence had nearly allowed to happen in the sky above their own city. Amelia convened an emergency board session through video call within the hour, her composure barely holding together as she tried to control the narrative before anyone else could shape it for her. Evelyn Catherine, one of the longest-serving board members, asked pointedly why leadership had not disclosed any safety concerns before federal investigators arrived at the hangar unannounced. Amelia attempted to frame Mason as a disgruntled former contractor with a grudge, but Evelyn immediately requested access to every internal warning email connected to the case. Lucas, sensing the direction of the conversation shifting away from him, began quietly assembling a different version of events. He drafted an internal memo suggesting Mason had tampered with inspection systems himself, manufacturing evidence of a defect in order to extort a larger settlement from the company after his termination. He handed Amelia a heavily edited version of the report, hoping she would present it to the board as an alternative explanation. For a brief, dangerous moment, exhausted and desperate for any way out, Amelia considered trusting him one more time. Mason was called into a smaller side room for additional questioning while the board session continued elsewhere. Lucas followed him in, attempting to provoke a reaction by reminding Mason that no one would believe a struggling single father over a chief executive backed by a team of expensive attorneys. Mason remained composed, telling Lucas plainly that he had mistaken silence for weakness, and that the two were never the same. It was Connor Isaac who finally stepped forward as a formal witness, choosing honesty over the fear that had kept him quiet for weeks. He told investigators directly that Lucas had instructed him to backdate inspection entries and had personally moved sensitive records out of the building in the middle of the night. Lucas turned on him immediately, calling him disloyal and accusing him of fabricating the claim to save himself. Jackson intervened, separating the two men and ensuring Connor's statement would be recorded independently, free from any pressure Lucas might attempt to apply. Slowly, the fuller picture began forming in Amelia's mind, one far more uncomfortable than simply blaming a single disgruntled technician. It was not only Mason standing against her decisions. The entire structure beneath her leadership had been quietly rotting under the relentless pressure to protect profit margins above everything else. Still, she was not yet ready to accept full responsibility. She asked Mason directly why he had not simply come to her privately instead of contacting federal regulators immediately. Mason reminded her, without any trace of satisfaction, that he had tried exactly that, and that her response had been to throw his contract onto the floor and tell him to sue her if he disagreed. The words landed like a blade returning to its owner. This section carried the emotional weight of internal conflict. Amelia caught between resentment toward Mason and a growing, unwelcome fear that he had been right about nearly everything from the very beginning. Later that day, federal investigators reviewing the company's internal servers uncovered a message instructing staff to preserve the flight schedule by any means necessary. The message had been sent from an account belonging to Lucas Owen, but Amelia had been quietly copied on it as well. Jackson placed a printed copy of that message on the table between them and asked Amelia to explain why she had never responded to it. Despite receiving it days before the fracture was discovered, Amelia stared at the page for a long moment, searching for an answer that would not sound like an admission. She said she received hundreds of messages daily and could not personally review every operational detail, a defense that sounded thin even to her own ears the instant she spoke it aloud. Evelyn, listening from the adjoining room where board members had been permitted to observe, made a note of the response without remark, though her expression suggested she found it far from satisfactory. It was becoming clear to everyone present that leadership at Aeronova had built a culture where uncomfortable truths were quietly buried rather than confronted, and that culture now had a name, a timestamp, and a federal investigator's full attention. The investigation widened quickly beyond the single aircraft that had first drawn attention, expanding to cover the entire Aeronova fleet under Jackson's direction. Inspectors found maintenance records that appeared unusually pristine across multiple jets, yet the physical condition of several airframes told a very different story. Components listed as replaced on paper still bore the wear and manufacturing marks of parts installed years earlier. Purchase invoices did not match the inventory records they were supposed to support. One aircraft carried a documented history of unusual vibration during a prior flight, a warning that had been dismissed at the time and never properly resolved before returning to regular passenger service. Mason assisted the technical team throughout the process, helping investigators interpret patterns of wear that untrained eyes might overlook entirely. He took no satisfaction from what they uncovered. Each additional flaw they identified reminded him how many passengers had likely boarded those aircraft without ever knowing how close they may have come to real danger, purely because paperwork had been altered to keep flights moving on schedule. Amelia watched the fleet she had once proudly showcased to investors now marked one aircraft after another with warnings and grounding notices. She remembered every reassurance Lucas had given her over recent months, phrases like "nothing serious," "the technical team already handled it," and "the mechanic is overreacting again." She understood now with painful clarity that she had consistently chosen to believe whatever version of events required the least disruption to her schedule and her ambitions. Evelyn Catherine informed her, without warmth or hesitation, that the board had voted to suspend her operational authority for the duration of the investigation. Amelia absorbed the news in stunned silence. Only one day earlier, she had commanded every decision inside that company. Now she could not enter her own hangar without prior authorization from the very people she had once directed without question. Lucas attempted to leave the premises with his phone and laptop still in hand, but airport security stopped him at the request of investigators seeking to preserve any remaining digital evidence before it could be altered or deleted. Cornered and desperate, he turned his blame directly toward Amelia, insisting that every decision he made had been driven entirely by the performance targets she herself had set and repeatedly reinforced. This marked the turning point where the story refused to offer easy innocence to either side. Amelia had not personally falsified a single document, but she had built and rewarded an environment where deception became the path of least resistance for those working beneath her. Mason told Jackson plainly that if Amelia had simply been honest from the beginning, pausing a handful of flights and authorizing proper repairs, none of this collapse would have been necessary at all. Jackson responded that federal safety regulations were rarely harsh toward people who made mistakes and corrected them honestly, but they showed little mercy toward anyone who chose concealment instead. Amelia heard that distinction clearly, and for the first time since the crisis began, something in her posture changed, as though the weight of pride she had been carrying had finally begun to crack under its own pressure. A preliminary technical report confirmed what everyone in the room already suspected. Had that particular flight departed as originally scheduled, the aircraft would have faced a serious risk of structural failure once it reached cruising altitude and full cabin pressure. The aviation authorities scheduled a formal emergency hearing, bringing together company representatives, board members, legal counsel, and the technical witnesses whose testimony would shape whatever came next. Mason arrived not seeking revenge but simply to lay out the sequence of events as clearly as the evidence allowed. He described the moment he first noticed the fracture, the falsified records that followed, the demand that he sign a safety certification he knew to be false, and finally the two words that had set everything else into motion. Amelia sat across from him, stripped of the confidence that had defined her only days earlier. The company's legal counsel attempted to undermine Mason's credibility by drawing attention to his financial situation, suggesting that a man under money pressure had every incentive to exaggerate a defect. Mason did not flinch from the implication. He said plainly that needing money would have given him every reason to sign off and collect his payment, yet he had refused to do exactly that. The room grew quiet at the simplicity of the answer. Connor confirmed once again that Lucas had directed him to alter inspection dates. Server records confirmed that maintenance logs had been modified only after Mason submitted his original warning, a detail that closed off any remaining argument that the documents had simply been imperfect from the start. Jackson summarized the findings without exaggeration. Aeronova had operated aircraft while aware of significant risk, falsified maintenance documentation, obstructed timely inspection, and endangered passengers who had no knowledge of any of it. The authority confirmed that the grounding order would remain in place, that seized records would stay under review, and that portions of the case would move forward for deeper investigation. In the aftermath, informal accounts of the incident began circulating simply as the morning federal regulators grounded an entire empire built on appearances. Amelia understood, perhaps for the first time in her career, that reputation and wealth carried no weight at all against a properly documented record of the truth. She rose from her seat, and for a moment it seemed she might argue further, defending herself the way she had defended herself throughout the previous day. Instead, she turned toward Mason and said, quietly, that she had been wrong to dismiss him the way she had. Mason did not offer immediate forgiveness. He told her that an apology, however sincere, could not undo the danger those flights had carried before anyone outside the company knew to stop them. Amelia's composure finally broke, if only slightly, unable for the first time to hide behind a title that no longer shielded her from consequence. Lucas was escorted from the room after attempting to remotely delete files from a company server, an act that only deepened the legal exposure already building against him. Amelia, by contrast, agreed formally to cooperate fully with the ongoing investigation, a decision that would define the difficult months awaiting her ahead. Outside the hearing room, journalists waited for any statement leadership might offer, and Amelia's assistant asked whether she wanted a prepared response drafted before facing them. Amelia declined, saying she would speak for herself, rather than hide behind carefully rehearsed language that had gotten the company into this situation in the first place. When she finally addressed the small group gathered near the entrance, she did not deny what had happened. She acknowledged that safety concerns had been raised and ignored, and that responsibility for that failure rested with her regardless of who had physically altered the paperwork. Mason left the building quietly, without speaking to reporters at all, aware that his part in the process had been to provide evidence rather than narration. Hannah Madison met him outside, telling him the documentation he assembled had been thorough enough that the case would likely proceed cleanly through every remaining stage of review. For the first time in days, Mason allowed himself a slow breath of relief, though his thoughts stayed fixed on the passengers who would never know how close that particular morning flight had come to disaster. In the weeks that followed, Aeronova remained partially grounded, its market value falling sharply as investors withdrew their commitments, and several longtime clients canceled contracts outright. Lucas Owen faced both criminal and civil proceedings connected to the falsified maintenance records. His career effectively ended by decisions he had made trying to protect a schedule rather than the people who depended on it. The board demanded a complete restructuring of the company, beginning with an entirely rebuilt safety division answerable directly to regulators rather than to internal executives chasing quarterly targets. Amelia Grace no longer sat atop the company with unquestioned authority the way she once had. She was required to testify publicly, acknowledging that a culture obsessed with profit and appearances had pushed the company toward the edge of catastrophe. She sought out Mason at an independent maintenance shop where he had returned to steady, quiet work, arriving alone this time, without lawyers trailing behind her and without any assistant managing her image. She handed him the full payment he was originally owed, along with additional compensation the board had approved as part of the settlement process. Mason did not accept the envelope as a gesture of charity. He reviewed the documents carefully and signed only for the amount he had rightfully earned. Amelia then offered him a position as the company's new director of safety once operations were permitted to resume. Mason declined immediately, unwilling to become a symbol used to polish the company's damaged reputation. Instead, he set one condition of his own. If Aeronova genuinely intended to change, every technician on staff needed the authority to halt a flight the moment they identified a genuine danger, without fear of losing their job over it. Amelia agreed without negotiation, understanding at last that this single principle mattered more than any deal she had ever chased. Sometime later, Aeronova resumed limited operations under an entirely new set of procedures, less impressive to outside observers perhaps, but considerably safer for everyone who boarded those aircraft. Mason did not walk away wealthy from revenge, but he reclaimed his dignity, recovered the wages he was owed, and proved that an ordinary man could bring an entire empire to a halt simply by standing firmly on the side of truth. In a final quiet moment, Mason walked past the same hangar at sunrise, watching as an aircraft waited patiently on the tarmac, cleared to move only after he personally confirmed the safety inspection had been completed properly. Amelia stood some distance away, watching him work, understanding fully now that the two words she had once thrown at him in contempt had ultimately destroyed the version of herself she used to be, while also forcing her, however painfully, to become someone better. The story closed on a feeling of quiet, earned justice. Mason never needed to shout and never needed power of his own to win. All he ever needed was evidence, patience, and the unwavering support of a system built to protect the truth when someone finally trusted it enough to speak. Word of what happened at Aeronova traveled quietly through the wider industry, reaching maintenance crews at other charter companies who recognized uncomfortably similar pressures within their own workplaces. A few technicians elsewhere later said the case gave them the courage to raise concerns they might otherwise have swallowed for the sake of keeping their jobs secure. Mason never sought that kind of influence, and he never spoke publicly about the case beyond what the investigation required of him. But the ripple of his quiet decision reached further than he ever intended it to. Connor Isaac remained with Aeronova through its restructuring, eventually earning a formal role within the newly created safety division Mason had insisted upon. He often said to anyone who asked that watching one man refuse to bend under pressure had taught him more about integrity than anything else in his short career. Mason kept working much the way he always had, steady and unassuming, never chasing recognition, content simply knowing that the aircraft leaving his hands were finally as safe as the people boarding them deserved. Mason Carter never wanted to be anyone's hero. He wanted a fair wage, a safe aircraft, and the simple decency of being believed when he told the truth. What he got instead was contempt, humiliation, and two careless words meant to put him in his place. Instead, those words became the spark that brought a powerful company face to face with the law it had quietly ignored for far too long. His story is a reminder that quiet people are often underestimated, that patience and evidence can outlast arrogance, and that real justice rarely needs to shout. If this story moved you, carry Mason's calm resolve into your own life, stand firm when it matters, and trust that honesty, given enough time, still finds its way to the light.